Hello and welcome back to the Market Property Experts Landlord YouTube channel. And we're delighted to welcome to this morning Pete Bywater from Ridgewater Energy. And Pete, we're here to talk about a new guide that you've produced with BCP Council in relation to mould and condensation in rented properties. It's quite a topical area, particularly last year. There were announcements from the government that they were going to start prosecuting landlords. Is that the right term, Pete? Or is it clamping down on landlords on issues of mould and condensation in properties after the tragic death of a young boy up in Manchester? So I think it's definitely an area which is a little bit misunderstood, maybe from a landlord and tenant point of view as to who's responsible for what. So I think these guides that you produce are going to be quite useful, hopefully.
Certainly hope so. Yeah, that was the main reason for bringing those up to date. We did have a condensation and mould guide from donkeys years ago, but it was a bit too wordy, and we kind of realised that people weren't necessarily going to better trawl through that lot and kind of take it all in. So the idea was to try and simplify the messages around it and make it more image based, so people could relate it to their own everyday activities, because that's where, certainly on the tenant side, a lot of the issues come, and people just don't realise the volume of water they produce in their own property. It just, if you look at it, you can understand why. I mean, when you look at a family of four and it's like 35 litres of water from certain activities, you think, well, how is that even possible? How can I generate that much moisture from breathing and showering and cooking and all these things? I can understand why people can't get their head around it. It is a difficult concept to try and understand. But this booklet hopefully lays that out in simple terms, and hopefully will allow them to start understanding, those kinds of figures and why it is an issue and why it's not necessarily all down to the property. So we try and tackle that on the tenant side. It's a shorter guide. It's more punchy. It's more straightforward. It picks up on those key themes, and hopefully it delivers messages simply that can be acted upon by the tenant to reduce what they're actually generating in the home. Whereas with the landlords one, yes, it does cover that, to kind of give them that information so they can kind of have those conversations with the tenant and kind of match up with that conversation around the behavioural change in the household. But also, it gives landlords a bit of a route map as well of what they should be looking at in their property in terms of the maintenance issues, the kinds of things that get neglected, that don't, all landlords have got an obligation, of course, to do their gas safety certificates and their electrical inspections and, the carbon monoxide and smoke alarms and all that side of things. But when it comes to, weeds growing out the guttering, there's nothing there that says every year we're going to do a weed check in the guttering or measure how thick the dirt is that's built up and the moss and everything else. Equally, there's nothing to say that landlords have got to have some sort of channel around the outside of their walls to make sure that any rainwater percolates away to foundation level to try and keep the moisture away from the outside walls. So there's all sorts of stuff in there which hopefully gives landlords a bit of an insight to go, I'm going to kind of go into this as a landlord and say, how can I avoid some of these complaints and issues and some of these tenancies being cut short because there are issues that I could actually take action on, and some of them quite easily, to avoid those issues. It makes it easier and cheaper for the landlord in the long run. There's less maintenance, there's less void periods, there's less redecoration to do because of condensation and damp. It's a win-win situation, really, when it comes to just looking at these things and saying, let's make sure the exterior of the building is up together. So, like I say, the pointing is good, the drains are clear, the gutters are clear, the bricks that have got the faces missing, spalled bricks, they're replaced or faced up. That the sealant around the windows where the water can't get in, that the chimney has been checked and repointed or reflashed. Same with flat roofs, extensions, that they're properly trayed off, and lead flashing is good and not allowing leaks in through those methods. So they look at all those things and keep on top of that maintenance, then that'll pay for itself in the long term.
Yeah.
In terms of those, reduced maintenance costs over time and those reductions in tenant turnover. I know at the moment, it's more of a captive audience in the rental market. There's a shortage of rental property, but people will still make those decisions if all their clothes are getting ruined in the wardrobe and growing mold on them, growing fur, then they're not really going to want to stay there. They're more likely then to stop paying their rent, get into dispute, and no landlord wants to go to court and get into dispute and go through those things that they don't really have to. So it kind of makes sense for landlords to try and get on top of that, deal with the basics, make sure those extractor fans are kept clean, that they've got in the kitchens and bathrooms, and that they work. Sort of assessing things like the cooker hoods. If they're not extracting cooker hoods, maybe upgrade it to an extracting cooker hood. If you've got an outside wall behind the cooker, again, that's gonna help. And then once they've done that, they can turn around and say, look, we had a complaint about condensation. Can't be my fault because these are all the things that I've done. So it must be down to you drying clothes on the radiators indoors, not opening the windows, blocking up all your vents, isolating the extractors. You can kind of look into it and say, what is the tenant not doing now? Because I've done everything I can as a landlord. It's over to you, and I'm going to help you. This is what you need to do and how you need to do it. Beyond that, we've obviously got to cope with the fact that tenants are finding it, some tenants find it very difficult to effectively heat the property now because of the costs of the heating.
Yeah.
And it's even more difficult reinforcing that message around the fact that you've got to open a window and have the heating on. It's kind of a misnomer, but it's the best way to lift moisture from the property. Heat the property up first. The moisture becomes mobile. It lifts it off the surfaces, and then you do your purge ventilation, open a window, and you get rid of that moisture much more quickly. If you try and ventilate with no heating before you ventilate, then that moisture is going to be sluggish and lazy. It's not going to be as laden in the air, and it's not going to travel out anywhere near as quickly from the property. So it's those kinds of nonsensical bits of advice that are sense that you need to kind of let people know about and tell them about. And then hopefully they can do things actually do quicker, and solve the issues. So
with these slides, then, what's the kind of timescale for this being released?
So it's out now.
Yeah.
In all good libraries, not record stores, sadly.
Yeah.
We've literally taken delivery of about 7,000 of the tenant ones and 2,000 of the landlord ones.
Yeah.
So we can distribute some physical copies of those out to agents in public spaces and etc. Obviously, the council will have a stock of those as well to give out on their visits and everything. But anyone that finds them useful can get in touch. We can post them out a copy or drop a few off to them to their branches or whatever. Equally, there's electronic copies on our website. Very soon, hopefully, it'll be on BCP's website as well.
Yeah.
I think BCP Council on their landlord newsletter is going to be going out on that as well.
Yeah.
With a link to it or an attachment to it. So it'll certainly be available.
Yeah, we add that into our tenancy documents before that goes out. I think we've had an old damp guide that we've used for
probably the previous version from Poole. It was Poole Council,
Yeah.
and it's probably about 7 or 8 years old. And these things do need to be updated for the purpose of new audiences and a different way of showing that information. So I think it's really great work that's been done to produce this, and also to produce it for both the landlord and the tenant. It's the more people that see that information, the hopefully the better that these issues become in managing. But I know you kind of covered some of it in your answer, Ron, but what do you think are the most common areas that landlords should pay attention to?
If you've got a portfolio of properties, I would start with the most densely tenanted properties with more people in. The real acute issues tend to happen in shared houses and student houses, because of course then you've got maybe 5, 6 separate people all having showers.
Yeah.
Sometimes all cooking separately their meals and soaking their pans in the sink overnight, and there's all sorts of reasons why things don't happen. And again, of course, let's turn the heating off, guys, so we can get another couple of pints of beer in. We go out on Friday night or whatever. It's we've all been there. It's one of those things. So you kind of got to give them all the tools you can do, but that's where you're going to find most of your moisture. But also properties where you've got no outside drying areas. If you've got a flat with no balcony, it's all internal, or you've got a property that's mid-terraced and I don't know, you haven't got used to the garden, or it's a first floor flat and the ground floor flat's got the garden or whatever it is. Ideally, if you can do as a landlord, you want to try and create some sort of option for outside drying, if at all possible, or at least have that conversation as an agent, as a landlord with that tenant saying, look, we appreciate there's no outside drying area, but just be aware if you are going to dry clothes indoors, that you need to open a window, close the door to that room, ideally block up under the door so the moisture can't travel. That kind of stuff. Just trying to give that advice primarily. I think that's one of the major causes, because you can imagine the amount of water that one thick jumper can hold, let alone a week's worth of washing for a family of four. That is probably one of the key things. But also it is, the amount of water spray and moisture that you create having a shower. This is why really it's essential to have some kind of extraction point in a bathroom or shower room, if at all possible. Appreciating the fact that sometimes you can't get an extractor fan out through an outside wall in some of those properties. Sometimes you've got to go up through the ceiling into the roof space and out under the soffit with those kinds of systems as well. You might have a passive ventilation system up in the loft, which is forcing air, through into the property to push out the moist air through any gaps and drafts and vents. There are various solutions to it. But like I say, failing that, again, it's giving advice to the tenant to say, look, if you're having a shower, appreciate it's going to be cold, but if you've got a window open during the shower, but straight after, make sure that you've got a bit of warmth in that shower room before you jump in the shower, and then you ventilate straight away afterwards for a period of time. And this again comes into, if people have to be reliant on opening windows to ventilate, then you really should be supplying them with windows that are lockable so that they can do that safely. Because we all know people are, certainly living in some areas of Bournemouth and Poole, it might be they're more concerned, or they're a more vulnerable tenant and they need to be able to lock that window open securely to ventilate, or even better as well, to have trickle vents fitted on those windows if they haven't already got them. And that's quite straightforward. It could be as simple as drilling 3 holes through a window light and sticking a grill on either side with a slider on it to actually, make sure they've got trickle vents on them. So those are some of the key things to kind of look at for a starting point.
So would you say that an extractor fan is more efficient than a window then, or which is it, how if you've got the option of one or the other, or you've got both, what's the best way?
Well, ideally an extractor fan. Certainly when we're looking at some of these grants that we're dealing with now, if we're following what they call the retrofit process, we have to actually do a ventilation strategy now. And what they recommend for a bathroom is a 30 litre per second extract rate on an extractor fan, and a 60 litre per second on a kitchen extractor or cooker hood fan. So something that can get rid of the moisture fairly quickly before it has a chance to kind of settle on surfaces, too much, or at least get rid of that moisture quickly so it's not doing any damage. Of course, you need to have it just running on for a sensible amount of time. You might have it running on after the light's been turned off to say 15 minutes in most cases. If it goes on too long, then all you're going to do is start sucking all the heat out of the property as well, and then creating a sort of another issue there where you're probably cooling down more surfaces internally by sucking out all that moist, warm air. So there's got to be a kind of cut off, and this is why some people use a humidistat fan, which senses humidity in the air and then cuts out when it reaches a certain sensible level, and then you achieve that balance as well then.
Yeah, I think these fans that just go off after a minute, it's just not going to do the job, is it? It's not going to be sufficient enough for what's needed.
That's right. Yeah.
I think that what it's done is it's illustrated that it is a joint effort between tenants and landlords, living conditions, and landlords maintaining properties. And I think that's the key point, I think, to get across. And thank you very much for joining us and talking to us about this, Pete. It's been really good to speak about it, and we will definitely be sharing that.
We'll download it and we'll make it available on our blog.
Yeah, we'll make sure it's available to tenants and landlords that we speak to all the time. And I think it's a really important issue and something that that we all kind of need to can do with some education on sometimes. So
Relearning.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Maybe you should just finish off by saying this is, again, partly in response to government guidance that came out in September, as you said at the beginning. There's quite a lot of information in there about some of that information and why they're doing it and what landlords should look out for in terms of the type of tenants they've got and why those tenants might be vulnerable and need that additional support and need that property to be maintained and that advice given.
Yeah, brilliant.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much, Pete. And it's really good to speak to you. Take care.
Thanks a lot. Take care. Cheers.